Technical difficulties notwithstanding, welcome to our 8th session today of our Parables Bible study. Last week, Jan Crow mentioned, and probably several of you felt this way, she mentioned how much she really couldn't stand the parable of the prodigal son for various reasons, I think, that it pushes buttons in us, as every good parable should. But I thought to myself as I really got into this parable today, there are very few parables that could have followed up the prodigal son and be worse, or be less intelligible or more challenging to kind of make sense of. And the truth is, this is another one of those stories that scholars have just pulled their hair out over because it's just it's a mess. It's complicated. And again, good parables do that. That's kind of the point. But scholarship has long just had all these unanswerable questions. And a lot of us, as we read this parable, we come to a lot of these same confusing conclusions. Now, what makes scholars think that these are authentic words of Jesus is precisely because they're so confusing. They're so just, what is it that we're reading here? So a couple of the things that may come up or have come up for you when you looked at it. It's hard to determine where the parable stops and where the sort of moral observations that come afterwards start. Now, I only assigned to you today the first 8 verses of chapter 16. That's where most scholars believe that this parable just ends. That's the end of the parable. But there's verses 9 to 13, as you read it, that go on and kind of further reflect on what the parable said. And a lot of people and a lot of scholars, they've been concerned because at the end of the parable, say the end of verse 8, it appears to have the master commend the manager for what is apparently something dishonest. And people have thought, well, why would Jesus commend something that's dishonest? I don't get it. And the truth is, there's the master in the parable, who's the Greek word is Kyrios, and then Jesus is often called the master throughout the Gospel of Luke, Kyrios as well, except Jesus' version is, his is a capital K. So there's confusion there. And I think that's something we should just keep in mind. Confusion is the point, okay? Gray is what it's going for. And if we can kind of keep our minds around that, it'll help us, I think, to navigate this. Another problem. What the heck was it that the manager did? What was his action? What actions did he take? Did he do something fraudulent? Did he continue to do something fraudulent? Did he just sort of sell out his master by discounting all those bills? Or did he cut his own take? Because there's a lot of folks and a lot of scholars that have speculated that managers in this situation, someone who's just paid to manage the accounts and everything of this rich guy, managers often gave themselves a little cushion, on the bills so that they could get paid. So a lot of scholars have speculated that when he cuts all those bills, he kind of just, cuts out his own overhead, his own markup, his own salary. Could be, but the parable never says. It leaves it gray. Okay, that's something that's there. But also, when it says he was clever and he's sort of commended for being clever, but was he wicked at one time? Was he clever later? Or was he always both wicked and clever? Parable doesn't quite tell us. The issue with those morals at the end, how do they connect? Are they sort of just thrown in, or do they really add to the parable? We'll get into that a little bit, but that's something for you to look at afterwards. The point is, this parable, like so many of them when we get into them, it just doesn't lie flat. And it we want it to. And this is part of the problem. And so it reminded me of that, one of my favorite poets is Billy Collins. And he had this wonderful poem, I think it's called Introduction to Poetry. And I wrote down the verse. I didn't. Is it? Yeah, it's called Introduction to Poetry. But it says this. This sort of captures, I think, our approach to parables. His poem goes, "But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin by beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. And I think that so beautifully captures what we often want to do with a parable. We want to beat it into submission and try to get a bruised but clear confession of meaning. And I think our approach today, as it really always is to resist that temptation and let this parable speak to us through the messiness, through the complications, through the grayness that it offers us. So those are my introductory comments. I want to open the floor now for any of you who have any questions or concerns or comments at this point before we go into the reading.
Well, Dan, this is Bonnie.
Bonnie's waving. Yep.
Yeah, I didn't quite get it. I had to read it a couple of times. At first I thought, did he pocket the money? But then why would his master or supervisor think that was a good thing? So then I thought, well, maybe they couldn't afford to pay the entire bill, but they could afford to pay part of it, and he got that for his master. And so that was the kind of quote unquote shrewdness that the master thought was a good thing, but I wasn't really sure if that was it or not.
Yeah, and I think you're naming something that a lot of us struggle with, that what the parable gives us is quite bare bones. And so we often make these assumptions or leap to conclusions about certain motivations or about what happened. And so our job today is to kind of step back. Let's look at what the parable actually says. There's so many rabbit holes we could dive down in terms of our assumptions or what this means or what this does. You know, if we approach this from a business perspective versus a spiritual perspective or theological perspective, there are so many rabbit holes that I think our best job is to step back and look at what the parable says, and let's try our best, not at least early, to not jump into, you know, sort of assigning what it might mean or what the motivations are. But it's hard to resist that, and that's on purpose, because the parable invites us in. It pulls us in, like Al Pacino in Godfather 3. It does not let us go, and so it's almost irresistible to avoid those points and those questions that you created, Bonnie. And those are good questions, but I think let's take that step back first and sort of try to see what the parable is saying and maybe what it's not saying. Anyone else? I see Jay.
The parable is sometimes referred to as the shrewd manager or the dishonest manager.
Yes.
Well, since shrewd is not necessarily dishonest, it can just mean smart. Is it supposed to lead us somewhere down that path, or?
It is, and it's once again suggesting the gray nature of this parable, Jay. You're picking up on it. The word that's translated in English often as dishonest in some translations is called wicked. And the only time that word dishonest is used is in verse 8. Okay, and it's sort of just put out there. But we'll get into that. It's like, okay, well, what was the dishonesty? You know, what is it sort of saying? And shrewdness, you're right, shrewdness is not the same. And shrewdness is such a bizarre word. We don't really use it that much. We often, I think, load that word in modern times. We load the word shrewd with a little bit of like this, you know, a little like smart. But I think there's a little bit of a negative connotation that can go with the word shrewd. But back in the day, oh, there you go, Bonnie. Welcome.
I just figured out what was wrong.
Well, we're glad to see you. But the word shrewd back in ancient days was one that was very much valued in ancient Israel. And shrewdness is lifted up throughout the Old Testament as a means of survival, as a means of street smarts, as a means of using your resources around you to get accomplished what ultimately serves you and serves God. So that's a very specific word, but you're right. It's not the same thing. There's not really a connection between shrewd and dishonest. I see Boyce and then Carol.
There, now you can hear me.
Gotcha.
When I read this, I was trying to figure out, okay, obviously what it was saying, but of that time, people were living under a suppressed government, I guess you could say. And I got the feeling that this was kind of a disguise of how to live in this government and still serve God. And that it's more important to serve God than the government. And you need to be shrewd, streetwise, in order to live in this government and survive. And in my version, which is probably a little bit different than the rest of you are reading.
Usually is.
Yeah, it talks about streetwise people are smarter in this regard than law-abiding citizens. And that reminded me of the parable we had last week. The son who was doing what was right didn't have the party. It was the son that went out and was looking at his life and wanting to have a different kind of life that got the party. And then it goes on, they are in the constant alert, looking for angles, surviving by their wits. I want you to be smart in the same way, but for what is right. So to me, that was saying, you know, you got to live in this society the way you are, but do the right thing, but also be a survivalist and use your wits to get around some of these things that are causing grief.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well, I think
it
you're
seemed to fit kind of that. It's hidden so that the government doesn't know what he's talking about.
well, okay, that's a lot there to unpack. But let me just say this, what you finished with, I do think that the parable is speaking about how do we operate in the world, bigger than government per se, but in the world, how do we operate in ways that serve ourselves best ultimately and serve each other best? And how do we figure out what it looks like to actually do that in our particular circumstances? And this parable provides quite a messy circumstance in which the means and ends of God are still accomplished. So let's look at that, and then we can kind of see how what that message is might pertain to government or those other things that you were mentioning. But let's kind of look at the parable, and I do think that you're naming some of the themes that it is trying to bring up. I don't know if it's a hidden message per se about a specific government that they were living under. I certainly think that people understood what it was like to be indebted at that time. A lot of the family farms were being bought out by larger farms, and so a lot of the long time industries or businesses were being sort of lost, and that was happening in this age. So they would have understood some of the themes that are connected to this, but I don't know that that's necessarily where the parable was trying to focus on. It might be, but we'll certainly consider a lot of those themes that you brought up. I thought, was it Carol? Did I see? Yeah, Carol next.
Well, I had a note from a previous Bible study that said the manager does one thing right. He sees relationships as important. That true riches are in a relationship. So maybe he was being shrewd in figuring this way he would be ingratiated to these people. So when the time came that he was down and out.
Yeah, and it does say that. The parable says that is his motivation. It's one of those rare instances that it says right there, it's like, I'm going to do this so that when I'm out of a job and I know I can't dig ditches and I don't want to beg, that I'll have something. But I think you're right. That theme of what does it mean to be fully alive and where is our best life happening? It's that there's a movement that he makes in terms of from accumulative and holding like this to sort of spreading and in a community type setting. So we'll look at that for sure. Anyone else? All right. let's go into it. I'm going to switch screens so that you can follow along. I'm going to read the parable, just verses 1 to 8. But let's see, here we go. As long as it comes up, there we go. Okay, so the parable of the dishonest manager, or sometimes called the shrewd manager. Then Jesus said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer. Then the manager said to himself, what will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes. So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, how much do you owe my master? And he answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, and how much do you owe? He replied, 100 containers of wheat. And he said to him, take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. Dun, dun. Okay. So, what? Someone have a comment?
Can you see my hand?
I do. Yes, Donna.
Yeah, well, it's that last sentence that I'd like to discuss in more detail, because that one was very, it was a head scratcher for me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure exactly what that meant, unless.
I would say this, that a lot of times Luke uses that designation, the children of light, to refer to Israel as the chosen people.
Oh.
And so in this sense, he may be comparing those who are in this generation, who are listening to the message of what Jesus is saying, to those who are sort of the ancestral Jews, who are more inclined to be like this. Prove it to me, Jesus, you know? And that's a dynamic that is consistent throughout the Gospels, but particularly in Luke. Who are the ones that tend to listen? The ones of this generation that Jesus is talking to. Who are those people? Well, I think we know who are the ones he talks to. It's the sinners, it's the prostitutes, it's the fishermen, it's the ones that are sort of the outcasts. I'm losing you, Donna. You back on the roller coaster?
Yeah, I'm trying to look at the passage
I
again.
got you. So
Sorry.
there's
I
that.
have
And
an
so there's a
iPad.
comparison sometimes that happens between those people who are more receptive to the message and the ones who are a little bit more entrenched in ancestry, history, the law, that sort of thing. And that often is being compared. And in fact, one of the things that's helpful when we look at difficult passages like this is to put it in context. So what's the context of this particular parable? What has happened around it, or what's happening around it? Does anyone have a thought or a guess, or does anyone know? What's the context? Last chapter, chapter 15 of Luke. I didn't see a hand. Did I miss somebody? No. Okay. In Luke chapter 15, you have the Pharisees come up to Jesus and they're like, we can't believe you. You're terrible. You're not a respectable person. All you eat with sinners and hang out with prostitutes. Who are you? Who is this fellow? And that's when Jesus goes into the parables of the lost. Okay, the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son. Immediately before this parable, we've had the parable of the prodigal son. Chapter 15, Jesus sort of directs these parables more towards the Pharisees and the scribes as a way of kind of wagging a finger, kind of more of a polemic, a negative, saying, hey, this is what it's like. In chapter 16, if you notice, it goes right into, and now Jesus speaks to his disciples. It's a pattern that Luke does, bouncing back and forth. When Jesus speaks to the Pharisees and scribes, the children of Israel, so to speak, it's more of a negative, kind of in-your-face finger wagging. When Jesus then in turn speaks to his disciples, we can expect it to be more an exhortation, a positive uplifting. If that pattern holds true, then this parable would be deemed to be some type of a positive uplift. Another thing, so right before it, he's having a controversy with Pharisees. Right after this parable, like immediately after, in chapter 16, verse 14, it says the Pharisees mock Jesus for his teaching. What that tells us is that this parable that we're covering today is something that the Pharisees kind of overheard. It wasn't directed at them, but they were sort of in the room, and they were listening to this. They were part of it sort of in an ancillary way. So Jesus is speaking both to the disciples, but also he knows that the Pharisees can hear. That's an important understanding. And also, as I mentioned, that whole fact that the prodigal son appears right before this, try to remember what we talked about last week about what the point of, some of the points of that parable were. It might be informative to what this parable is trying to say. Any questions or comments about the context? No? Okay. All right. So what is the actual trouble that the manager gets into? What's the trouble that he gets into? Bonnie? Gotta unmute yourself.
Obviously, he isn't managing the books very well. So he's not being a very good manager. And so I think that his supervisor wants to replace him with somebody that can do a better job.
Well, it's an interesting point. I like most of what you said. You used a word, though, that I'm not sure I agree with. Is it obvious? Is it obvious that he's been a bad manager? Carol, I see you waving your head. Waving your head. I see you shaking your head, and I saw you wave. So you go ahead.
No, I was saying I don't think it's obvious what he had done wrong.
Yeah. It says, it's very interesting. It says that he was accused of squandering. And so I'm talking early on in the parable, at the beginning. And squandering is an interesting word. In the Greek, it's not about sort of doing something wasteful or illegal. The word squander, to squander like that, has to do with, like, think of it as sowing seed, and you're sort of just flinging it everywhere, and you're maybe not getting enough on the good soil. That idea is what squandering implies in this Greek term. So it's this sort of sense that this master was upset about this accusation about his manager. He was upset in the way that the manager was basically flinging the seed of the master's riches. That's what he's upset about. So basically, the manager is managing, okay? And there's this accusation that he's squandering the funds or the wealth or whatever. And so then the rich man goes in and just basically fires him because he's not satisfied with the managing. That's what the parable gives us, okay? Everyone see that? Is there any questions about that? Yes, Donna.
Well, the owner asked the manager to give him his accounting of what he's been doing.
Yep.
But you never get that answer.
That's right. That's right.
So, whether he was or he wasn't, we never know that.
Yeah. And you're right. We don't know. And again, it's part of the gray of this parable. In the English, I think a lot of the words that we see, I'm looking at my passage now, that I think it's verse 1, that it says that he was charged with squandering or something like that. And we look at that as if it's a legal term, but really he was just accused. Somebody accused him. And the Greek word that's used there can also be translated as slandered him. Somebody slandered the manager, potentially, about squandering the rich man's funds. And so the rich man hears this, makes a determination, tells him he wants an account. And that's not the only gray area there, Donna. He says, I want you to account for what you did. And oh, what, by the way, I'm firing you anyway.
Right. Before you can ever say anything.
Exactly. Isn't that bizarre?
You cannot defend
Yes.
yourself.
It's part of the bizarre grayness of this whole parable. So just hold that, we don't need to figure it out. It's intentionally messy though. Okay. That's what it's playing with. That's part of what it's playing with for us. Any other questions or comments about that? Bertie. And then Dan. Yeah.
The manager's role reminds me a lot of that of the tax collectors. And they were very hated, and they always collected more than what they needed to keep some for themselves. And so the manager could have been doing that. And I think, and that's why he was so concerned about his future, because he was hated by everybody.
Well, I think you're right. Well, there's a lot that you've said there, and I think you're really picking up on some themes and some chords that this parable is intentionally playing on. In much the same way that tax collectors made their living, this manager makes his living. Tax collectors were expected to sort of take in more. That's how they got paid. That's just how it worked. Now, they were despised for that. Maybe not so much for that, Bertie. That was a part of what was required. They were probably more despised for the fact that they were seen as collaborators with Rome, that they would basically be trying to, squeeze every last dime out of their brethren, of their brothers and sisters in Israel. But yes, there was definitely a negative overtone to tax collectors. And the fact that the manager, his job is similar to that, may well have been a chord on which this parable was playing. And that's part of what makes it, it's another gray area. Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Well, that's part of it here. So I don't know if I responded to everything there, but thank you for that. I saw Dan, and then I see Marilyn.
Well, I disagree with Bonnie. I don't think there's any evidence that he has mismanaged. All they have is a rumor. So the boss is acting on a rumor.
I think, yes, Dan, I would agree with you. And I think what Bonnie was responding to is that when we get further on into the parable, we see that he's called dishonest by the master. Now, we don't know, is the master of the parable, or is the master Jesus? That's part of the gray area too. So you're right. When you look at the evidence within the parable, it's like, whoa, all of a sudden, it's not so clear what the whole dishonesty, mismanagement thing really was. Again, that's the point. And it's also how powerful titles are to these poems, or parables, I should say. Like last week, calling it the Prodigal Son focuses so much attention on the young son that we miss so much of the meaning. Well, maybe calling this the parable of the dishonest manager overly prejudices us toward a certain interpretation that the parable never quite intended for us to sort of overly focus on. But that's a good point. And Marilyn, I saw your hand.
Yes, I was just thinking that it's so important that we keep in mind the context, that in many ways we wouldn't know. So for us, the word manager doesn't really have any kind of positive or negative connotations. But if managers at that time were seen kind of analogous to tax collectors, then there could be some real, I love that idea that he became aware, he knew that he wasn't accepted in people's homes. And if he lost his job, it was going to be real important that he be. So he was having people lower their bills and what they were going to pay to bring good feelings on himself.
Right.
But
one way or another, he knew that his options were limited. Be they because he was not socially accepted, or be they simply because he wasn't just physically capable of digging or doing hard labor or alms, begging for livelihood. So he didn't have good options. So you're right that he figured out then quickly that his best tact was to do what he did in order to preserve self. Okay, as a part of it. Okay. Did I miss any hands? I see Bonnie.
So then, I guess maybe I was thinking broader. So is his major role then is just a bill collector. He's not really managing the money. He's just, it's kind of like, don't shoot the messenger just because you have bills and I've come to collect them.
I would say it's more than that. That's a great question, though. A manager is more than just sort of the bill collector accountant. The manager is empowered to sort of act on behalf of the owner, of the rich man, so in this case. So he would be making deals. He would be sort of the proxy for this. It was a very respected position in that sense. Now, from the parable's perspective, to indicate the way he is paid, might make those connections with the fact that it's tax collector. But I think overall, just to respond to part of what Marilyn said and some others, I don't necessarily think that the manager as a job itself in that society was looked at, just from the get-go as kind of having those negative, questionable vibes per se. He had a lot of power. He had certainly had the trust of his master to do what he was doing. And then somehow he loses it in this parable. Any other questions or comments about that? Hold on, I see it. Yeah, so one of the translations that when we were talking about squandering, someone just sent me a note that it says wasting the goods. And that sense of throwing seed maybe on bad soil, or it's just sort of like, okay, he's been accused of this. Okay, whether or not it's true, though, is still up for grabs. Okay, obviously the rich man, the owner, assumes it's true because he says as much. So then, just to establish, what is it? Why is the manager called dishonest? What does he do actually that's dishonest? Do we know? Voice.
Turn it on there. I talking away to myself. Our internet is connecting and disconnecting. I missed all of what you said. So you may have already talked about this, but the way my Bible tells it, the manager was actually having those who owed money change their bill. He wasn't changing it for them. And did you already talk about that? Because I found that silly. Why would you have them change it? Because surely the boss guy would know what they owed, or somewhere there was a copy, but maybe they didn't have copies. Maybe that he could get away with that at that time.
Okay, well, but you bring up a good point. Is he accused of dishonesty because of lowering people's bills? Or is he called dishonest because of lowering people's bills?
I didn't see that anywhere.
The answer is no. The text never uses that term in a direct accusative connection to the act of lowering bills.
Right.
And in fact, at the beginning, when he's accused of being a squanderer, and the rich man just sort of assumes it's correct, that's where something maybe of the dishonesty perhaps happened. But the only answer is, we don't know what the dishonest act really was. We're just told in that one little verse, that one word, and in verse 8, that he was just called the dishonest manager. And we don't really know what that means. And again, the word dishonest in some translations is translated as wicked. He's a wicked man. Now, wicked is a word that's come to be really laden with meaning in our time, but wicked in that day would have been someone that was sort of in alignment with the ways of the world, in alignment with the ways of mammon, the stuff, the acquisitiveness, the selfishness. That sort of wickedness is that which pulls you into yourself, and you're so self-centered and self-focused. That's not all that wickedness is, but it's not necessarily that all the connotations that we lay on that word. But anyway, in many translations, it's called dishonest. And the answer, the point is, the parable never tells us what was dishonest. We just We just are told that he is, one way or another. He's dishonest. Okay? It's very gray. Very gray. Yes, Donna. Oh, and then I see Horty.
Where does the title come from, the dishonest manager? I mean, Jesus didn't stand in front of the crowd and say, okay, this is a parable about the dishonest manager.
That's right.
Where does that come from?
It comes from verse 8, the one time that it's mentioned, that one of the English translations of that word is dishonest. But again, it's not always called the dishonest manager. Sometimes it's called the shrewd manager, the parable of the shrewd manager. And again, that's part of the challenge of this parable is which one is it? Which ones is it trying to tell us about here? And just like last week when we focused on prodigal son instead of lost son, we focus on prodigal son. That means we focus all our attention on that young son, and we miss the fact that the older son was just as lost. So,
right now, where is the word dishonest in the actual?
Verse 8, 16:8.
16:8. Going not.
Yeah, the master praised.
Oh, there, I see.
I saw
okay.
Horty as well, and then Margaret. Horty. Got to unmute, Horty.
Sorry.
There you go.
There we go. We don't know that he's dishonest. He's called dishonest. That doesn't mean he is. And it's sometimes you're named something, but that doesn't mean that's your core value, or that doesn't mean who you really are. You've been called something.
Right. The parable never tells us. It just says that he was called dishonest. Yeah, that the master thinks of him as dishonest. The master calls him dishonest. Really good distinction. Margaret?
Well, where did it say that the manager had the authority to discount their accounts? I mean, that's not being dishonest. He's kind of generous to the other people.
Well, it's a good question. And just in case, because the audio is a little bit fuzzy, but I got it. Her point was, where does it say that the manager had the authority to lower all those accounts, all those bills? And what he does is a tremendous act of generosity to do that. And look, as a manager, he was given authority to manage the accounts. Okay, so he would have had the authority to do this. Now, it's speculative as to, all right, well, was he just basically taking his master's money and just giving it away? Or was he taking his own cut? It doesn't say, and it doesn't evaluate that. The only thing it evaluates is that it commends the manager for that very act. It commends him for it. Oh, you're very shrewd, very good job. It doesn't judge it otherwise. So we really don't know. We don't know if this just saved his hide. Did it save his job? Did it change his ways? Did it open him up? We don't know. The parable doesn't say. Again, it's gray. It's gray. He's called dishonest, but then he's lauded. He's commended for being clever or for being shrewd. What are we supposed to do with that? Again, hold the gray, folks, okay? Don't try to find your way to the black and the white here. Hold the gray, okay? I see, did I miss someone? I see Barbara Tellman and then Jim. Yep. And then Dan and
Okay.
So this is my interpretation, but I realize it's my own. So I believe that the reason that in his mind, he needed to do something to make himself look better in the eyes of the community, or he wasn't going to get another job. And so in his mind, he said, well, I have wasted all of these things that I was supposed to be keeping for the manager, and I probably he took them for himself. Of course, we don't know that.
It doesn't tell us any of that, though, yeah.
Yeah, but he says, I want my people and my community to like me and help me in the future. And maybe he had a bit of angst over doing this because he knew it was wrong anyway. And so he's trying to make amends by what he does with his changing of the bills, telling the people to change the bills and only give part of it. Probably they'd given him the rest, but we don't know that.
Most of what you said, we don't know, Barbara. And I think it's important, like what you did there is that's what the parable invites us to. That's what interpretation is. But really in what you said there, and this, please don't take this is not about right or wrong. I love everything you said. But what the parable tells us is basically that he approached this lowering of the bills because he knew that it would get him into good graces. It doesn't say that he would get money from it. It said that he realized that he was about to be very vulnerable when he was out of a job because he wasn't going to beg and he couldn't do other stuff. So he felt one way or another, it doesn't tell us why, but one way or another, he felt in a very vulnerable position. And so his act of lowering bills was a way, just like you said, to get into the good graces of his community so that he would be held as a part of it, as opposed to if he had done nothing, he would have been sort of all on his own. So there's a lot in there. And I don't know that again, the parable is just not giving it to us. And it doesn't mean we can't go there. I think our job is to go to these explorative places. But again, there's a lot of rabbit holes that we could go down. So what the parable gives us is much more succinct than often the interpretations that we make. I saw Jim and then Dan, and then I think it was Marilyn.
Dan, is there anything to the word master? It really doesn't define who the master is, at least the way I'm reading it. Maybe I'm reading too ethereal.
No, I think, again, the parable is intentionally gray, and the master of the parable is the same word, it's Kyrios. The master of the parable is the same title that Jesus uses, or that Luke gives to Jesus throughout the gospel. Jesus is capital K, Kyrios. And I think that's the point. Oh, wait, is the master supposed to be Jesus? I will say this, no, but maybe. There's elements of, wait a second, which one is which? I don't think it's supposed to be an answered question, though. I think, again, the parable is laying the gray out to us to reach something at the end. But so the master, be it, sometimes I think it's mostly speaking about the master of the parable, but Jesus is also called that title. So a lot of people have puzzled over what's the relationship there.
Okay. I was trying to think of why, he would use the word master as opposed to employer or, boss or something along that line.
I don't know that it's a particularly, unique title. I think it is one of honor, but I don't think it's particularly unique, not in my awareness, that it would have been like, whoa, to call him master is like on a par with Jesus. No, I think that Jesus' title of being master was one that was a term of respect in that day, but not of sort of unique respect.
Okay.
Dan?
The title of the Prodigal Son tried to focus us on the son and ignore the older son. Maybe that's the same issue here. We have the dishonest manager, and maybe it's the master who was dishonest because he fired this guy and he wasn't dishonest.
I love your instincts, Dan. I think you're onto something. And again, the original writings of this, they never titled any of these. It was later within Christianity. As I said last week, the prodigal son only became called that when Jerome, I think it was Jerome, that's 4th century, named it such. But he didn't just call it the prodigal son. He called it the prodigal and the unrepentant, or he was speaking about both. And so eventually they started to call it the lost son, and again, that's much more open because then it allows us to focus on, well, who is really lost? And to call this the shrewd manager or the dishonest manager might overly focus. So I think it's important to step back from that. Thank you. And because you're right. What are the qualities that the master exhibits that we might want to look at? He doesn't get out of this scot-free either, as far as, having to carry some type of a weighty negative title. Marilyn?
Yes, well, I was thinking that the manager could have done just the opposite and had the people change their bills to give the master more, rather than what was sort of to try to earn favor with the master. And instead, he really focused on sort of the less wealthy, far lower down people who had the bills, and made a generous offer to them. And it could very well be that that also reflected positively on the master, because they didn't know where this was coming from. And
That's
so
right.
the master could have been seen more highly because of this act than otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's a lot. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I mean, I think based on what the parable tells us, it's the manager feels cut off from the master. He knows he's going to be fired, so there's not really, to me, an avenue for trying to make amends there with the master. That this was his means of saying, all right, I got to survive. I got to figure out how am I gonna. I've lived this way. I'm cut off. I can't work for whatever reason. So I'm going to do something that's going to ingratiate me. So I'm going to lower bills, and that's one way to do it for sure. But as far as I lost my train of thought. Sorry. What was the last part of your question?
Well, I was trying to think what could be the rationale for the master deciding that this was really a good move, and he was being
Right.
shrewd.
Because
the master could end up being seen much more positively by these people.
Oh,
too.
that's right. Yeah, and it very well could have been, because when the manager's out there lowering the debts, nobody knows that he's been fired.
Mm-hmm.
So they think he's acting on behalf of the master. So you're absolutely right. They would have seen that as an act of beneficence on the part of the owner. And one person put it out there. A good way of thinking of this in modern terms is think of the rich man as the company owner and the manager as, say, the CEO. Okay, something like that. So they would have said, oh, he's acting on behalf of the owner. So it does show well on him. But yeah, why would the master commend this manager? What is the sense of that? I saw Jan, and then I saw Bertie. Jan.
Okay, it seems to me that when the master was firing the manager, he really had no reason to think he was dishonest except maybe rumors. But then the manager did do dishonest acts. I mean, they were all very nicely wrapped in good feelings, but what he did was dishonest. And so now the master knows he's dishonest, and that's why he calls him dishonest in line 8. But he also commends him. So perhaps by doing what he did, he kind of saved his job, because now the master is looking at the manager as kind of a clever boy and maybe someone he needs to keep around.
Well, that last part is completely speculative, but because it doesn't tell us. But I think you're onto something. He calls him dishonest while he's commending him for his shrewdness. Again, gray. He's not just doing good. Oh, but wait, he's dishonest. What the heck? What am I supposed to take from this? There's something here, folks, about how he's lifted up this guy for his shrewdness. And again, shrewdness being he was practical. He was clever. He did what he needed to do to survive. He took what was in front of him and he made something out of it. That's being shrewd. That's what the manager did. That's then what the master commends him for. And it's a challenge, from a business perspective. If you interpret this parable from a business perspective, it makes no sense. But from a spiritual perspective, and again, he's using the themes and the symbols and titles from business, but it's not about business. I mean, it's in the realm of business. It's not just about business, okay? So from a spiritual perspective, it's commending us to take what we can out of our whatever situation and use it in all pragmatic ways that we can, to use our resources in ways that not only ensure our survival, but that benefit those around us. That's part of what it's saying right there. That's what he's commended for. But as Jan noted, It's not just a commendation. He's calling him a dishonest manager right in the middle of his commendation. This is bizarre. Okay, I missed who was after Jan. I think it was Birdie. Yeah. Microphone.
Yeah, you pretty much said what I was thinking, that the master commended him not so much for the act he did, but for planning for his future, and the future that Jesus would be concerned about would be our eternal future. And so what we're doing with our goods now, it's not, planning for the future isn't so much as hoarding for our old age, but are we using our goods to help God's people? Are we using our goods to further God's word?
Yes. And that is a constant theme throughout Luke and Acts. For those of you that were in our Luke and our Acts Bible study, that is one of Luke's major ways of showing a real lived faith. How we use our worldly goods is one of the chief indicators of whether or not we get Jesus' message. Okay, that's a big thing for Luke. And so, yeah, I think that theme is absolutely brought up here in this parable. Did I see another hand? Peter, and then Margaret. Oh, and then Susan.
So could it be that during this time when land was being confiscated from people because they couldn't pay their debts by large Roman landowners, that the system that was set up was dishonest? The entire system is dishonest. So that anyone who participates in that system is also dishonest. And that there's a double negative here when the dishonest manager double crosses the dishonest system and shares wealth in a way that helps rather than hurts the original landowners. And it's not even a Jubilee year.
Right. Beautifully said. I think that you have taken the gray and shown some of what I do think that this parable is trying to say. Mm-hmm. Okay? That the gray of all of this is that we're all in it. We're in a system that is corrupt and dishonest. Okay? There's no one within this, that comes out squeaky clean. So stop acting like being squeaky clean even matters. It's like, who do you even want to emulate in this parable? We say, oh, well, that rich man was he commended him. He was so nice. No, as Dan pointed out and others, he basically took these accusations and he didn't even give him a chance to defend himself. He just fired him outright. The landowner, the owner guy is presented as sort of a jerk. Oh yeah, he says some nice things at the end. Great, you commend me, but you still fired me and left me out to hang out to dry. And so, yeah, he's got some nice qualities, but he's not squeaky clean. Oh yeah, well, what would you act like the manager? Well, maybe, but then was he cutting people's bills 20 to 50%, just basically throwing away his owner's money? And not only that, he was making the bill payers, the debtors, complicit in the act. Did you see what he said? What the parable said? He asked them to write their own invoices. He's making them complicit. So the end result is, as Peter said, that the wealth is being spread. It's being sort of thrown out like seed even. But it's so gray, isn't it? And we don't really have a good entry point. Some parables were like, oh yeah, I definitely identify with that character or that one. This one, you're sort of like, well, Margaret, I had seen your hand before.
Well, I think you told me in the message, what would I do if I was the man? You know, what am I supposed to do now in the present day to correct whatever? You kind of told me already that not everybody is clean or squeaky clean.
Yeah. Well, let's think about this. In what ways is the manager like Christ?
Well, he gives to the others.
He forgives our debts.
Ah. Yes, he gives to the others. He forgives debts. First of all, he dies and he rises again. He kind of has a death where he's cut off and he rises again. What else? What are some other ways? Boyce?
He doesn't look at the acts that you do. He looks at more the intent or what the heart is doing.
I think that basically is the main one. Yeah, he sort of dies and rises. He makes sure everyone shares in that resurrection that he experiences by his actions. But I think what you just said is where I really see this parable trying to help us see what Jesus is all about. And that is that there's something unique here in this parable that's showing us how to or helping us realize that grace does not come as a result of being respectable. Okay? The Pharisees and scribes have accused Jesus just before this of how he's just completely, he's not a respectable human being. Look who he hangs out with. And Jesus comes as one accused of being sort of a disrespectable, just kind of just the socializing with the worst of society. He was seen as wholly outside the bounds of respectability. And Jesus came to show us, and this parable came to kind of indicate that respectability isn't what it's about.
Yeah.
It's not about starting off as being respectable. Society looks at it like that. The Pharisees and the judges of the world do that. The business, whatever. Yeah, they look at the most thing that's paramount as respectable. That's winning. That's success. That's the stuff that matters. But Jesus came, and this parable is here to tell us, to remind us that grace doesn't work that way. If it's all about having to be respectable, then you don't understand what grace is. Death and losing is what Jesus is talking about, death to our old self, to our selfishness, losing our greed, losing our singular attitude of focus on our navels. That's the death and losing that Jesus is talking about. And that's where we experience real grace. Okay. So then if this is sort of some of the themes that this parable is trying to point us toward. Again, there's not like a singular meaning here, but we've seen a lot of gray. We've seen some people kind of noting what it could be pointing us to. What do you think the point of this parable is? What does it provoke in you? There's a lot of possibilities. So you feel free to go ahead, Marilyn.
Well, I'm not sure I'm really answering your question, but I am so taken by the fact that nobody in this parable is sort of acting kind of saintly. It's people of the real world and doing things that people do. And so it means that I could be very acceptable. I'm not saintly. I'm the kind of person that I am living in the real world could receive grace. And anyway, that means a lot to me. I like that.
I think you did answer the question. I think that is a part of what this parable is trying to say. It's like, look, you read a parable like this, and basically it's trying to say that if you imagine that you live in a morally simplistic universe where everything's black and white, then you're not old enough to be living in this universe. Because what it's also saying is that everyone is caught up in the complicated mess that is our world, is our systems, our life. Okay, we're all caught up in it. And it's clear that if you think that you're always clean, or if that's your job to kind of become clean and righteous and saintly, as you said, Marilyn, before you can do anything, then you've missed it. You've missed it. And this parable is really trying to say just that don't spend all your time trying to be idealistic and waiting for the perfect moment to act. Because if you do that, if you wait for it to be perfect, for yourself to be clean and justified, and before you'll follow and try to act in Christ-like ways, you'll never lift a finger. But thank God it wasn't about that to begin with. It wasn't about being respectable and clean and law-abiding, but it was about just being where you are. Yeah, okay, we're all in it. We're all in a mess. We've all got sin. We've all got mistakes. So what? Any one of us is just like that parable of the prodigal son. I think it's like the father didn't wait for an apology, and he didn't wait for until he could muster enough strength to forgive the son. No, he just ran out, and he wanted that reconciliation to happen. Well, in much the same way, if we don't wait for things to be perfect, okay, in our lives, we just recognize that we're all enmeshed in something or other that is either known or not known. The point is, there's still possibilities for acts. We can manage to be compassionate, to act with justice. Okay, that's some of the things that it provokes in me. What else does it provoke in you, Carol?
I was wondering, since he was addressing the disciples, was he trying to tell his disciples exactly what you said? You know, you're set apart, but don't forget that you're still working under grace.
Well, I think he is speaking to the disciples, so this is directed at them, but it's not only for them. And they all know that they're outcasts already. You know, as coming from the backgrounds that they came in, they would have been seen as working or lower class citizens anyway. So sort of dismissed or discarded in a lot of ways. So they already knew that. But what's also clear is that in the greater context of Luke's gospel, the Pharisees and the scribes and the elites are overhearing this. So Jesus is laying this out there for everyone to hear and take their own meaning from it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other reflections or thoughts on what this parable provokes? What do you think about where we started and where we've gone with it? Has your sense of this parable changed? Mm-hmm. It's not an easy one, for sure. It's sort of like Jesus. I think one of the reasons Jesus would tell a parable like this is because he was so tuned in to how complicated life is. You know, a lot of you have seen Good Will Hunting, and there's that classic scene where Matt Damon, if you haven't, you need to, but Matt Damon's talking about how so many of the good things we try to do, we have no idea, we have no sense of all the ripple effect that's caused by it and all the harm that's actually caused by so many of the things that we're trying to do for the sake of good. So it's just like we're part of systems that are way more complicated than any of us know. So stop pointing the fingers of judgment at each other, at ourselves, and start allowing each other, start seeing the possibility, like Jesus sees, of each other to be able to work God's ways in the midst of the mess. Mother Teresa, I think she had this classic line that I included in the notes. She says, if you judge people, then you'll never have time to love them. Jesus was about stop the judgment. Yeah. And this parable is about, these are all things and people that we could spend all day judging and trying to figure out. And he's just saying, look, it's all gray, okay? It's all gray. There's good qualities, there's horrible qualities, and we're all a part of it. But don't let it stop you, because you are no more or less capable of performing acts that are, acts of compassion, acts of justice, of managing to get there. You're no less capable of doing that, no matter what your circumstances are. Thoughts on that? Okay. Well, that's really all I've got on this. So it's a lot to chew on. I think parables like this, go back and read it. Maybe read through chapter verse 13. You'll see some of the parables sort of reflections on that. Well, you'll see some of the Luke's reflections on that parable, and see if they if you read them differently, see if they're confusing, or see if you're like, oh, now I see what that might be referring to. That sort of thing, as we open this up. But I think this today was just such a good exercise in allowing the gray to sort of just be held there and sort of see what we can do. And I think that would serve us well in our approach to a lot of the scriptures, is not trying to find out, all right, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. That works well for movies, of course. And sometimes, some of the best movies are also about, some of our favorite characters are the great characters. So that's not just that it's black and white in movies. But we bring that lens so often to the texts. We look for who's the saint, who's the right, who's the wrong, that sort of thing. This parable is, I think, a good illustration of not really being able to do that. So I hope that you'll chew on this. I hope that you continue to, think about it. If you have any other questions or comments, you can send me a message or email, but otherwise I look forward to continuing the journey next week on Tuesday. Next week's parable is Matthew chapter 18, verses 23 to 24, so kind of short, called The Unforgiving Slave. Okay? All right, everyone. Thank you again.
Thanks,
you all
Dan.
for
Thank you,
attending
Dan.
this
Thank you.
rich
Thank
conversation. Look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.
Unforgiving
Thank you, Dan.
slave.
Thank you, everyone.